Okay, we're going to start our next unit on evolution and natural selection. Now we need to start with some background information so we can fully understand this concept. We're going to start by talking about Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. Lamarck was one of the first scientists to understand that life changes over time. He stated that changes are adaptations to the environment acquired in an organism's lifetime. He said that those acquired changes would be passed on to offspring. Now, this is not true, but this is what they thought at the time. So, he developed this law of use and disuse. He said that organisms could change the size or shape of their organs by using them or not using them. Here's some examples, and it's kind of crazy to think about. He believed that blacksmiths with muscular arms would pass those muscular arms on to their sons. Of course, we know that's not true. Muscular arms comes from working those muscles. Okay, the next one is a famous one. We know that over time, giraffes' necks have gotten longer. He believed this was because giraffes were stretching to get food. Not true. Snakes used to have legs. They don't anymore. He believed that snakes lost their legs because they weren't using them. Not true. Okay, so here's where he went wrong. Lamarck didn't know how traits were inherited. He didn't know anything about genetics. Now, genes are not changed by the activities that we do in life. A change in genes needs to happen through mutation, which typically happens before we're born. Now, here's Charles Darwin, the naturalist. He is the most famous name in evolution. So, Charles Darwin was on this voyage aboard this ship called the HMS Beagle. It sailed across the Atlantic Ocean, and he was aboard this ship as a naturalist. A naturalist is someone who is looking at nature, looking at species, collecting specimens of plants, animals, anything along those lines. Now, once they reached the Galapagos Islands, this is when things got interesting. So the Galapagos Islands are a group of 16 islands in South America. There are varying climates among the different islands and a lot of very unique animals, such as tortoises, iguanas, and a lot of different types of finches. Okay, take a look at the different tortoises found in the Galapagos Islands. What things do you notice about them? You might say that some have shorter necks and some have longer necks. They also have different shell shapes. So, based on the climate that they live in and the food that they ate, they have these changes. Darwin also noted that the finches among the different islands were also very different. He believed that they all originated from one species, but once they were removed from each other, generations and generations later, changes accumulated. So we would see some finches on one island might have a large beak for cracking open seeds. Other finches might eat cactus fruit and flower and have skinnier beaks. So he noted these changes and saw that this is something that has been happening over time. Overall, Darwin saw that there's a large variety of species around the world. And left unchecked, the number of organisms in each species would increase exponentially generation to generation. But we know that this doesn't happen in nature. Populations tend to remain stable. And why is this? Because the environmental resources that they need are limited. There's competition for food, water, and shelter. All in all, his conclusions showed that production of more individuals that can be supported by the environment leads to a struggle for existence among individuals. This is important and this needs to happen. Only a fraction of offspring are going to survive to the next generation. We call this survival of the fittest. Okay, now let's get into the theory of natural selection. Okay, so what is natural selection? It is those with the traits that are better adapted to the environment are more likely to survive and reproduce than those that do not have the advantageous traits. Again, this is survival of the fittest, but you should know that the most fit organisms aren't necessarily the strongest. They might be the best camouflage, or they might be the ones who are best adapted to get food. Now, natural selection acts on the phenotypes in a population. Remember, a phenotype is a physical characteristic. Okay, this happens over populations, not individuals. Okay, so we have to see this change over generations over generations. Okay, this isn't something that happens quickly. And now, what is evolution? Well, evolution is really simple. It's just change over time in a population's genetics. And over time, if we are seeing small changes, we can create new phenotypes. How do these things change? There's a few examples. So, mutations in the DNA, environment changes. Therefore, those that have the best traits are going to survive those environmental changes. Those that don't have the good traits are going to die, and they're not going to pass on their genetics. Also, radiation and chemicals can affect the DNA and cause those changes. Okay, here's some examples. Reproductive isolation. So when populations can't breed with one another due to some geographic separation, over time, they may evolve to the point where they cannot breed with one another anymore, and they are then new species. Gradualism is when gradual changes over a long period of time lead to a new species. Okay, so in other words, natural selection is when certain variations survive, reproduce, and pass their variations to the next generation. Those with the best traits survive. And that takes many generations to happen. Another thing to note is that organisms cannot will themselves to adapt, to have a change. It has to have already been in their DNA. And it might help them, and if it does, they'll survive and pass it on to the next generation. Okay, you may have heard of artificial selection, so let's see what the difference between natural selection is. Natural selection, those with advantageous traits survive to reproduce. Artificial selection is when we do selective breeding to enhance the traits that we want to see in stock or crops. Now, Gregor Mendel worked on genetics, and he is the missing link in Darwin's understanding. There wasn't a mechanism to explain natural selection when Darwin was figuring all of this out. He didn't understand how these favorable traits were transmitted. And basically that's when Mendel's work comes in, because Gregor Mendel talked about genetics. Now, this is important. If you've seen this picture, you should know that this is not evolution. It is very misleading, and it makes you think that humans came from apes or monkeys. It's not true. Scientists say that there may be a common ancestor between the two, but that we did not come from apes. Okay, common descent with modification. Darwin proposed that organisms descended from common ancestors. That's the idea that as individuals of a species reproduce, there are changes over time. Okay? As the environment changes, organisms need to adapt. Some will survive and some will not. That's all evolution is change over time. Because I think we can all agree that nothing really stays the same over time. So those small changes may cause new species over time. And basically, what a new species is when, with the common ancestor, it cannot produce offspring anymore. And that's how we define a new species.